Today, you become a 19th-century Inuit whaler. At 8, my grandfather lashed me to a skin boat on the pack ice to learn the polar star. And at 46, I lashed my own grandson to that same boat to pass down everything I knew. In 1888, I was born inside a small snow igloo on the north shore of Baffin Island, and my grandfather wrapped me in caribou hide and carried me out onto the polar night snowfield so I could open my eyes for the first time on the stars above me. My father was the finest whaler our band had. Every voyage took him 20 days at sea, and he returned with his skin umiak heaped high with walrus tusks and polar bear hides from the ice edge. My mother sat all day beside the whale oil lamp stitching a caribou hide amati, and she always told me a good mother parka took 3 full months of stitching before it could shield a child from the polar night wind. At 6, my grandfather lifted me onto an old skin boat beached on the ice floe edge, pointed to the carved walrus bone prow, and told me this single piece of bone was the very life of all Inuit people. At 7, I began learning the names of the stars with my grandfather, and he taught me that the one who never moves and the 7 sisters were the 2 most vital stars for any whaler who hoped to survive at sea. At 8, my grandfather lashed me to the mast of a skin boat at the edge of the floe and let the cold swells rock me all night, saying every whaler must first learn to read the temper of the sea through his own seat. At 9, my grandfather pressed the first ulu half-moon knife into my own gloved hand, telling me every Inuit boy must be able to open up a freshly killed ringed seal entirely with his own 2 hands. At 10, my grandfather taught me to measure star altitude over the horizon using the width of my own outstretched palms, calling this the one true key to knowing which patch of sea your boat was in. At 11, my father took me out hunting seal for the first time, and he had me lie flat along the umiak gunnel so I could feel the hidden currents under the ice water through my own chest. At 12, I waited beside my grandfather at a breathing hole on the pack ice 3 full days and nights, and at last I drove my own bow and harpoon into the back of my first ringed seal. That same night, my grandfather anointed my forehead with a single drop of warm seal oil, and a dozen elders of our band circled the driftwood fire and shouted out my name Nuutuittuq. At 13, I learned to listen to the very voice of the ice, and a single muffled groan in the distance meant a bowhead whale was rising up beneath the floe to draw its next breath. At 14, my father took me out on my first true bowhead hunt, and with my own hand, I drove my grandfather's bone harpoon deep into the massive, thick back of that great beast. The whale dragged us under the umiak for 6 full hours before it would finally roll belly up, and I knelt at the blood-red water of the floe edge softly, singing the soul-sending song over it. At 15, the band tattooed the first whaler line down my chest, a slender straight line representing the one who never moves, running all the way down from my collarbone to my own ribs. At 16, I joined the men of the band learning to build a skin umiak, and 20 fresh sealskins had to soak 3 full days in the cold sea before they could be stretched over the driftwood frame. At 17, the polar night covered us for 4 straight months, and the whole village crowded into one large igloo, using throat-singing songs to guard the small fire still burning inside our hearts. At 18, I steered alone, leading 8 young men north into Davis Strait, and on our return our umiak prow was piled high with the tongues of 3 full-grown bowhead whales. At 19, I married a qajaq, the finest stitcher of skins in the whole band, and she stitched for me the very first true caribou parka I would wear as a grown man of our people. At 20, my wife bore me inside our snow igloo my first son, and my grandfather himself carried the newborn over and gave the little boy the name qajaq in our own tongue. At 21, I began leading the young men of the band north on the summer migration, trailing the bowhead pods, and a single voyage took us a full 120 days at sea. We followed the whale pods on the moving pack ice 3 full months, taking 1 bowhead every few days, and that whole year not a single soul in our entire band ever went hungry. At 22, our band held the Great Feast of Giving, and I distributed every single one of the 12 bowhead whales I had taken that summer to every neighboring family in our band. That night, the eldest shaman of our band stood beside the fire and called me the star whale aloud, and the whole village danced throat-singing dances around me through the whole polar night. At 23, the first Yankee whaling steamer entered Davis Strait through the pack ice, a massive iron-hulled vessel pouring black coal smoke into the clear Arctic sky above us. Aboard were a dozen white whale oil traders, and they bought from my father with 2 simple bottles of whiskey one whole bowhead whale that had cost him half a year to hunt down himself. At 25, with my own eyes, I watched the Yankees slaughter 6 bowhead whales in a single night, and the blood from their butchering stained the whole stretch of pack ice a deep crimson red. At 27, the bowhead whales of Davis Strait began to thin out badly, and through one whole summer, we took only the same share of whales we used to take in a single week. At 28, our band caught for the first time the blood-coughing sickness brought in by the white men, and 3 of our elders coughed so badly in one night they could not crawl from the igloo. At 29, the first whiskey bottles entered our village, and 2 young men of our band drew their ulu knives on one another out on the pack ice over the right to a single bottle. At 30, my eldest boy, qajaq, whom I had once lashed to the skin boat mast as a child, caught a lung sickness from the traders and died in my own arms in a single night. That same night, I knelt on the snowfield and one stroke at a time carved every letter of my son's name into a black volcanic stone, raising it upright in the snow at the head of our village. At 31, the first Christian missionary stepped ashore with the Yankee ship, and he demanded that our band burn every single carved walrus bone ancestor figure our elders had passed down. At 32, the first Canadian government wooden trading post was raised right beside our winter igloo camp, and from that day onward our band could no longer follow the bowhead migration freely. At 33, my grandfather, qajaq, died alone on the floe edge where he had always sat, still cradling in his arms the carved walrus bone star chart I had once made for him. At 35, our band was forced to settle beside the Canadian government wooden shacks, and for the very first time in living memory, we passed an entire summer without going to sea. At 36, the Canadian government took the whaling right itself away from us, telling us we now had first to go pay an unheard-of permit tax before any of us could hunt a whale. At 37, with my own eyes, I watched Canadian mounted police lead 5 children of our village onto a government boat to be carried south to a residential school far away. At 38, my own niece was taken away to the residential school, and 6 months later, when she was sent home, she could no longer speak a single full sentence of our Inuit tongue. At 39, the bowhead whales left in Davis Strait were only a tenth of what we once had, and the summer pack ice lay as empty and silent as a great white desert all around us. At 40, I wrapped the last ancestral walrus bone harpoon of our house inside an oilcloth and hung it up on the roof beam of the wooden shack, and from that day onward, I went to sea no more. At 41, my wife qajaq passed quietly away the very night she finished stitching the final caribou hidamati of her life, sitting alone beside the whale oil lamp inside our shack. At 42, I began studying the Canadian official tongue from the elders of our village, because the government now demanded that we sign our own hand on every whale oil tax form ourselves. At 44, my daughter bore inside a Canadian government hospital a baby boy, and she knelt down on the wooden floor and placed that newborn child into my own arms, begging me to name him. I gave my grandson the name Aklok, which in our own Inuit tongue means the paw of the bear, and that name had been the oldest praise word my own grandfather had often used over me. At 45, I carried my grandson out onto the same stretch of pack ice my own grandfather had once carried me to, and I let him open his eyes for the first time on the Polaris above us. In the early spring of 46, I dragged grandfather's old hidden skin umiak out of the ice cellar with my own hands, washed it clean, and restretched a fresh layer of sealskin over its frame. In the summer of 46, I lashed my grandson to the driftwood mast of that boat and took him with me on the very last bowhead whale hunt of my whole life across the open lead. This was the life of a 19th-century Inuit whaler. If you have ever given yourself entirely over to a single stretch of ice sea, leave a comment. Next episode, pick A Viking raider, or B, a Sahara camel caravaner. Vote in the comments. This is a fictional dramatization for entertainment only.